prosecution called 6 expert witnesses during the trial. The defence consulted several experts, but didn't call any of them to take the stand. This lack of expert witnesses for the defence concerns one of Britain's most senior pathologists.
I am a paediatric pathologist, a perinatal pathologist. I have 25 plus years of experience. We deal with 500 deaths a year in my institution and many neonatal deaths. So I think that I have quite robust expertise.
She doesn't want to be identified because she says the case is too controversial. She deals with bereaved families and says being associated with this case could have an impact on the sensitive nature of her work. Still, she feels strongly enough to raise her concerns.
I'm not saying that she's innocent or she's guilty. What I'm saying is that the way that the pathology was presented, that is not convincing to me as a pathologist.
She's reviewed the case of baby O, the first of 2 triplets that Letby was convicted of murdering in June 2016. Baby O was described in court as a stable and healthy baby who collapsed unexpectedly. The court heard that again, X-rays showed a higher than normal amount of gas in his body. The prosecution said Letby murdered him by injecting air into his stomach and into his veins, and by inflicting a severe liver injury.
After baby O died, there was a post-mortem done by a very experienced pathologist, Dr. George Kokai. He found baby O had 2 hematomas, 2 spots of internal bleeding in his liver. These are usually caused by injury or surgery, but there are other ways they can be caused. Dr. Kokai said they could have been caused by the umbilical vein catheter, the tube into the baby's vein through the umbilical stump. That could have damaged the wall of the liver. Or, he said, these hematomas could have been caused by a lack of oxygen. This is rare, but it happens. I've seen it a few times in my career. And we know this baby suffered from a lack of oxygen before he died. So either a lack of oxygen or trauma from the umbilical catheter could have caused the internal bleeding. And the expert for the prosecution said this was not possible, but I agree with the original report.
The prosecution's expert pathologist, Dr. Marnarides, disagreed with Dr. Kokai's original report on what caused the liver bleed. He said he's only seen this type of injury in a road traffic collision or in cases of child abuse.
Unless a witness saw non-accidental injury occur, then you can't say it. So to say that it is beyond reasonable doubt and that this was not something natural, that this is a non-accidental injury, to put it bluntly, it's naive to say that. It depends on the opinion and experience you have. I have seen it, but the prosecution expert must never have seen it.
Phylon 4 contacted Dr. Marnarides for a response to this, but he didn't reply.
He had access to a lot more than you have access to in making this determination. Do you not think it's possible that there's something you're missing here?
What Dr. Kokai says, it is exactly what I have seen as a prenatal pathologist in a couple of cases in more than 25 years' experience.
A report published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine 2 years ago found hundreds of cases of this kind of liver problem, all in newborn babies, all occurring naturally. In almost half, it led to internal bleeding, and the fatality rate was 87%. There was other evidence used to convict Letby of baby O's murder. She'd objected to the baby being moved to another area of the unit to be more closely monitored. She was accused of falsifying medical notes. And there was a rash, which prosecution experts said was consistent with air being injected into the baby's veins. They also said Letby overfed him with milk. And there was the fact that baby O's twin, baby P, who was also one of Letby's patients, died in similar circumstances the next day. 2 cases were absolutely pivotal in the Letby trial: the attempted murders of baby F and baby L. She was convicted unanimously of attempting to murder both babies by adding insulin to their feed bags. Both cases centred around the result of one test, the immunoassay test. It showed that in the case of these 2 babies, insulin levels were abnormally high. The prosecution said the results proved they'd been poisoned by insulin. But since Letby's conviction, these test results have come under scrutiny.
First of all, I don't know if Lucy Letby is guilty or not. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this issue, which I regard as being critical in relation to the laboratory measurements.
Dr. Adel Ismail is a former head of clinical biochemistry and pathology services at an NHS trust, and he's a leading expert on the immunoassay test. He says it can produce misleading results.
As I see immunoassay results which are false high or false low, that technology is more prone to error than the rest of the laboratory tests we use. In my research, I found the error rate is 1 in 200. If I have the slightest suspicion, I would do the follow-up tests to confirm the integrity and the veracity of the measurement. That confirmatory test is absolutely vital.
So it's your opinion that this test shouldn't have been used in a court without proper verification?
I actually think that these results, if I am producing them, I wouldn't forward them to the clinician, not in court, to the clinical colleagues without verifying the veracity and integrity.
So you wouldn't have even sent these results back to the doctors without doing extra verifications?
That is absolutely correct.
Follow-up tests weren't carried out. However, there are experts who believe these tests are good enough to rely on a single set of results and are confident of their use in court. But even if the results used in the Letby trial were correct, and insulin levels were abnormally high, more questions have emerged about whether they prove any wrongdoing.
Okay, great, thanks. Jeff, can you just introduce yourself?
Yep, so I'm Jeff Chase. I'm a professor at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Professor Jeff Chase is a mechanical engineer specialising in medicine. He's spent the last 16 years studying how insulin works in babies. He builds mathematical models to improve the management of insulin in premature babies, working with the neonatal unit in Christchurch, New Zealand. He's one of the few people in the world doing this.
My first look at those measurements, like, wow, those are pretty wild. But even if you assume those numbers are golden, there's a range of possibilities for that, and some of those range from common to rather atypical.
The prosecution's expert witness said that in both cases, the feeding bags must have been poisoned with insulin because there was no other explanation for the high insulin readings. He said the baby's blood sugar was stubbornly low, even as doctors tried to treat it, and that could only have happened if they were being given insulin.
I would say that there are a range of other factors that could make those readings happen like that. Given the range of variability that you can see in the neonatal physiology.
Helen Shannon is a biochemical engineer. She's been working with Jeff Chase and a neonatologist to look at the calculations presented in court.
There is a degree of certainty presented in the case that is in no way justified by the level of uncertainty that we know about in neonatal physiology. This is a hugely variable topic. It is completely inappropriate to be that certain.
The prosecution said only a tiny amount of insulin would have been needed to harm these babies, that no one would have noticed it going missing. Helen Shannon has been working on a mathematical model to examine this, to determine how much exogenous or synthetic insulin Letby would have needed to harm these babies.
There are a number of areas of the insulin cases which require mathematics. Now, one of the areas is how much insulin would be required in order to achieve an insulin dosage in the bodies of these tiny neonates, on the hypothesis that the insulin level was accurate and the insulin level was due to exogenous insulin. We thought, well, let's just apply engineering principles and see how our results compare.
For baby F, their model suggested that Letby would have needed much more insulin than the prosecution claimed.
The range of answers that we get vary from about 5 times the amount to about 20 times the amount. There is huge variability, but that is more typical than not for these types of calculations.
For the second baby, baby L, the prosecution said only 1% of a vial of insulin would have been needed.
The calculations performed by Jeff and myself range from 20% to 80% of a vial.
That's quite different to 1%. So 20 times or 80 times the amount that the prosecution's expert witness said in court was needed?
Compared with 1%, yes, indeed, yes. Yeah.
If the model is correct, Lucy Letby would have had to inject much more insulin into the baby's feeding bags to generate the high levels seen on the immunoassay test results. But there was no evidence to suggest any insulin had gone missing on the ward. Again, this wasn't the only evidence against Letby. The prosecution said both baby F and baby L were doing well, up until she attacked them. Yet again, she searched for the parents on Facebook, and she was also convicted of murdering baby F's twin brother and attempting to murder the twin of baby L. In response to the issues raised in this programme, the Crown Prosecution Service told us 2 juries and 3 appeal court judges had reviewed a multitude of different strands of evidence against Lucy Letby, and she was convicted on 15 separate counts following 2 jury trials. It said the Court of Appeal dismissed Letby's leave to appeal on all grounds, rejecting her argument that expert prosecution evidence was flawed. Gudrun Young, KC.
Certainly from my point of view, I think enough question marks have been raised, and there are enough doubts as to whether or not the science in this case was as compelling and convincing as it should have been, that this should at the very least be looked at. I know this is extremely painful and distressing for the parents of these babies who don't want this process to be drawn out, and of course we can all have every sympathy with that, but it doesn't do our society or criminal justice any good if we simply shut down automatically those voices which are raising concerns.
The Thirlwall inquiry continues to examine the experience of families at the centre of this case, how staff and management of the Countess of Chester dealt with suspicions about Letby, and whether she could have been stopped sooner. When it opened in September, Richard Baker, KC, who's representing some of the families, said anyone doubting the case should be ashamed of themselves. He said the families are in no doubt that Letby is guilty. The jury were in no doubt that she's guilty, and that this is being arrogantly ignored. The hearings are expected to conclude early next year, and Lady Justice Thirlwall is due to publish her findings in the autumn.